The river did not just divide the land, it divided lives, dreams, and dignity. Every year, when the monsoon rains swelled its muddy waters into a roaring beast, it swallowed hope along with crops, turning simple journeys into dangerous gambles. And when the government engineer stood at the edge of that raging river, adjusting his helmet and shaking his head, his verdict fell like a hammer: this bridge was impossible. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the quiet strength of ordinary people, take a moment right now to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your voice matters more than you think. The villagers had gathered that day under a sky heavy with clouds, their faces lined with desperation. Children clung to their mothers, elders leaned on sticks, and farmers stared silently at the water that had stolen too many seasons from them. The engineer's words were polished and technical, full of reasons and calculations, but all they heard was the same thing they had always heard: no one was coming to save them. No one believed it could be done. Among the crowd stood an old farmer named Jonathan Hale. His hands were rough like the bark of the trees he had spent a lifetime cutting, and his back carried the weight of years of labor under an unforgiving sun. His clothes were simple, his face weathered, but his eyes held something that no storm could wash away: a quiet, stubborn determination. Jonathan had lost more to that river than anyone knew. Years ago, his youngest son had tried to cross during a sudden surge of water, carrying medicine for his sick mother. He never made it to the other side. The river had taken him without warning, without mercy. Since that day, Jonathan had stopped seeing the river as part of nature. It had become something personal, something that demanded an answer. While others listened to the engineer and slowly began to disperse, their hope sinking deeper than the riverbed, Jonathan stayed. He stood there long after the crowd had thinned, staring at the water, as if trying to understand it, to measure it in a way no blueprint ever could. The next morning, before the first light had fully touched the fields, Jonathan began cutting logs. At first, no one paid attention. The village had seen men try and fail before. Dreams were cheap, results were not. But Jonathan worked with a rhythm that felt different. He chose each log carefully, trimming, shaping, and stacking them near the riverbank. His movements were slow but deliberate, guided not by formal training but by years of practical understanding. Days turned into weeks. The pile of logs grew, and so did the whispers. Some villagers shook their heads, calling it a waste of effort. Others felt a quiet stirring of curiosity. Children would sit nearby, watching him work, their eyes wide with silent admiration. Jonathan did not speak much. He did not need to. His work was his voice. Then came the cables. They were not new, not polished or perfect. Jonathan had gathered them from old farms, abandoned machinery, and rusting fences. Each piece told a story of something once useful, now forgotten. But in his hands, they became something else, a possibility. The first time he stretched a cable across a narrow part of the river, it snapped under tension, sending him stumbling backward into the dirt. His hands bled, his body ached, and the river seemed to mock him with its endless roar. For a moment, even Jonathan felt the weight of doubt pressing against his chest. But he got up. He always got up. The second attempt lasted longer. The cable held, but the structure beneath it shifted, unstable against the current. Again, failure. Again, silence from the watching villagers. But this time, something had changed. A young man named Daniel, who had once lost his entire harvest trying to transport goods across the river, stepped forward and picked up a tool. He didn't say anything. He simply began to help. One by one, others followed. A woman who had spent years walking miles to fetch water began bringing food for the workers. An elderly carpenter offered his knowledge of joints and balance. Even the children began collecting smaller pieces of wood, feeling, for the first time, like they were part of something bigger than themselves. The bridge was no longer Jonathan's burden alone. It became the village's hope. The work was not easy. Storms came without warning, washing away parts of what they had built. The cables strained and groaned under pressure, and more than once, it seemed like everything would collapse. But each setback only strengthened their resolve. They learned from every mistake, adjusted, adapted, and tried again. Jonathan, despite his age, worked harder than anyone. His hands grew more calloused, his steps slower, but his eyes never lost their fire. He guided others not with authority, but with quiet example. He showed them that knowledge did not always come from books, that wisdom could be carved from experience, from failure, from persistence. Months passed, and then, one morning, under a sky that had finally cleared, the bridge stood complete. It was not perfect. The logs were uneven, the cables weathered, and the structure lacked the polished look of modern engineering. But it stood strong, stretching from one side of the river to the other like a defiant statement against every doubt that had once existed. The villagers gathered again, just as they had months before. But this time, their faces were different. There was no despair, no uncertainty, only a quiet, overwhelming sense of pride. Jonathan was the first to step onto the bridge. Each step was careful, measured, as the wood creaked beneath his weight. The river roared below, as if testing him one last time. But he did not stop. He did not look back. When he reached the other side, a silence fell over the crowd, followed by something that had been missing for far too long: hope. Soon, others began to cross. Mothers carrying children, farmers with tools, elders with tears in their eyes. The bridge did not just connect two sides of land. It reconnected a community to its future. News of the bridge spread far beyond the village. Even the same engineer returned, standing at the edge once more, but this time, his expression was not one of dismissal. It was one of quiet respect. He studied the structure, the logs, the cables, and then he looked at Jonathan, understanding something that no calculation could ever fully capture. Sometimes, the impossible is only impossible until someone refuses to accept it. Before we reach the end, take a moment to write one word in the comments that describes how this story made you feel. It helps more people discover stories like this. Years later, the bridge still stood. It had been reinforced, improved, and eventually recognized by officials who once doubted its existence. But for the villagers, it would always remain something more than just wood and cable. It was a reminder that strength does not always come from power or position, but from perseverance, unity, and belief. Jonathan Hale never called himself a hero. To him, he was just a farmer who refused to let a river decide the fate of his people. But to everyone else, he became something much greater, a symbol of what can happen when one person dares to try, even when the world says no. If this story touched your heart even a little, don't just scroll away, like, share, and comment to help keep these stories alive, because someone out there might need this reminder today. And as the sun set behind the hills, casting golden light over the bridge, Jonathan sat quietly by the river, watching the water flow beneath the very thing it could no longer control.